So I've just been asked to explain this diagram one more time, and I think it's important to everybody. Let's do that. So there is state A, state B. The parties are X and Y. And it could be slightly misleading because the only relationship that state A, state B have is the New York Convention. So that is what binds them. Party A, X, and party Y are bound by a contract. That is the arbitration agreement. So, if a dispute arises about the validity of the arbitration agreement, if a dispute arises between X and Y about the validity of this arbitration agreement, and the case is presented to the courts of state A, the rule of decision is set forth under Article 2.3 of the New York Convention. It says the court in state A, as a member of the New York Convention, must enforce the arbitration agreement unless it finds that it is null and void, inoperative, and incapable of being performed. That's what it says. So for the court in state A to enforce the arbitration agreement, which means to refer the matter to arbitration or not, it's guided by some substantive rules contained under Article 2.3. That's it. That's clear, right? So that's what they do. Applying this rule, null and void, inoperative, incapable of being performed, they may decide to refer the matter to arbitration. The arbitration could take place anywhere. But the arbitral award rendered by the arbitral tribunal comes before state B's courts for enforcement. Enforcement of the award. Here, enforcement of the agreement, the arbitration agreement. So, when you try to enforce an award in state B, the same party who disputed about the validity of the arbitration agreement here is given a second opportunity to raise the same question of validity before a different court. But the rule of decision before state B is slightly different because under 5.1a, it says under the law of the place where the award is made. The place where the award is made could be here, state A, or elsewhere. Wherever that is, it's that law that state B must apply. So as I said earlier, the grounds of invalidity under the state seat could be different from the short list under the New York Convention. So it's possible that an agreement that is considered valid at the enforcement of the agreement stage may later be found to be invalid because a different set of rules govern. So this is obviously very important to understand. Okay. Let's go back to these cases. This is an ICC case 6149. It's also about the choice of law. There is some lack of clarity in this case about why the Jordanian law was actually inserted in this. My sense is that there is some connection that is not explained in this excerpt. It's an edited version of the whole case. So, but assuming that there was some connection with Jordan, probably the ship owner or the shipment contract or it was a Jordanian company or something like that. So what was the choice of law question in this case? What were the alternatives? What were the possibilities, and why was it important to actually select one? One of the two alternatives. Obviously, because the application of one would have resulted in the invalidation of the agreement, the application of the other would have upheld it. So the court obviously went along with the one that upheld the arbitration agreement. And that was the law of what?
French law.
French law, because
they choose the ICC in Paris to resolve this dispute.
exactly. So because they say Paris in the agreement, and Paris is the seat of the arbitral tribunal, the court said then, just like the Japanese court, the tribunal said just like this Japanese court, by selecting the seat, they must have anticipated that the law of the seat of the arbitral tribunal should govern the arbitration agreement, the validity of the arbitration agreement. They actually refer to Article 5.1a of the Convention in this case, although that provision relates to the enforcement of the award rather than the enforcement of the agreement. And as we see in the Rooney case here, whether the same grounds could be imported into 5.1a is going to be, we'll discuss that when we get to that point. But there's some reference to Article 1.5a of the Convention. If you look at 291, the second from last paragraph, this conclusion would be supported also by Article 5.1a of the Convention. According to 5, the validity of the arbitration agreement has to be determined under the law of the country where the award was made. See? They are basically saying this is the same convention. One provision contains that choice of law rule. Why don't we use the same choice of law rule here? That's what they're saying. If this says the law of the seat and it's omitted here, we should assume that they actually anticipated that the same choice of law rule also applies. It's basically their own interpretation of what might have been anticipated in the convention. So the rationale is interesting. They said when two parties agree to arbitrate, at a minimum, we know that they didn't want to go to court. So whatever they might have done in that agreement, we should select a law that would upheld their intention. They would not intentionally choose a law that would invalidate it. You see the rationale? If we agree that these guys wanted to arbitrate, in selecting the applicable law, we should always be looking at a law that would uphold the validity of the arbitration agreement rather than one that would kill it. See? That's the logic. First, determine whether the parties wanted to stay out of court. Once you've made that determination, the choice of law should be easier because you would choose the one that would uphold it. But the problem to this, with this interpretation is, what's the problem with that interpretation? What if the law of the seat is the one that would kill it? Would the parties then be considered to have agreed to an arbitration agreement that is invalid? They make no selection under one, but they selected seat. If the seat of the arbitration tribunal, if the law in the seat would have actually said, no, this is not valid under our law. If you have first determined that the parties have actually anticipated to go to arbitration rather than go to court, would you still apply the law of the seat or find some other law, some pretext to find some other law that would uphold it? That is the danger with this interpretation of once you make the decision that they've agreed to arbitrate, you should always find a law that would uphold it. That's a problematic one because then the law of the seat may actually invalidate it. So if you follow that rationale, that means arbitration agreements of any type are almost always valid because you just try to find a justification in some law that would uphold it. In this case, it was so convenient for them, right? The law of the sea would have upheld it. Some other law would have struck it down. Therefore, they say, use this rationale. See? But for future references, it would have been just easier for them not to mention the justification because it's a very tricky one. It could actually result in the upholding of arbitration agreements no matter what they are. Just find a law that would justify it. Okay, let's proceed. Excel Insurance, UK High Court, 2000. So this is a typical problem. So you have multiple dispute settlement provisions, and it's not clear which provision had been incorporated into the policy. But in any case, both sort of say the same thing. So the seat of the arbitral tribunal was supposed to be where? Huh? The seat was in London. So what was the trouble with what was the role of New York law in this case? Why did it come about? There's some reference to New York law, right? The FAA, why was it referred to this?
Actually, the party refers to, they will assume that we will apply the provisions of the Arbitration Act in 1996. So that's the FAA.
No, that's the UK Arbitration Act, 1996. But there was reference to FAA in New York. If you look at the second full paragraph on page 294, the heart of Owen's submission was that by the choice of law clause, the parties chose New York law, which necessarily included the FAA to govern, among other things, the validity of the arbitration clause. And if submissions of the FAA are correct, the arbitration clause is invalid. On that approach, the effect of one of the two special conditions was to invalidate the other. This is what they call a knockout doctrine. The knockout doctrine is if in the same contract you have two different arbitration agreements, that means you don't have one knocks the other out. So that is sort of what they were trying. And the same principle, at least in this particular case, did not exist under the UK 1996 Arbitration Act. That is why they thought it would lead to a different outcome. And they go on saying the choice of law clause has to be considered in conjunction with the arbitration clause, by which the parties chose that any dispute relating to the policy should be determined not only in London, but expressly under the provisions of the Arbitration Act with the modifications such and such. And he says, I take the reference to internal regulation laws to extend New York conflict of laws in the absence of any reason to conclude otherwise. A provision that a contract is to be construed in accordance with a particular system of law would be taken as a choice of law that governs all aspects of that contract. But for reasons that I outlined, New York law cannot have been intended to govern all aspects of the arbitration clause. See, the law that they've selected for the actual insurance policy was New York law. And the party who did not want the arbitration agreement to be valid because of the existence of this knockout doctrine said, because the parties have selected New York law to govern the underlying contract, the court must also apply the same law for the validity of the arbitration agreement. The UK court obviously did not agree. They said, we understand if they have selected New York law for the substantive, the underlying contract, but it's entirely different. It's an entirely different question whether they actually intended to apply New York law to the arbitration agreement. So they've done two things, conflicting almost. One is that they say the arbitration contract may be, the underlying, there is some New York law application somewhere, substantive laws, but they also selected London to be the seat of the arbitration. So they made a substance versus procedure distinction. So by selecting London, we presume, just like the Japanese court, that they named Japanese law to govern London, UK law to govern the arbitration agreement, because it is procedural in nature. Now, let me ask you this question. If two parties sign an arbitration agreement that is contained in a broader underlying contract, and they say the applicable law, they don't say anything else, they say the applicable law in this contract, they don't refer whether it's the arbitration contract or the main contract. The applicable law in this contract is New York. What is your presumption about what they have intended to do? Do you think that two reasonable business people selecting New York law, that they might have intended that New York law governs the underlying contract, but not the arbitration contract? Do ordinary business people think the two are separate? It's only in law school that we think they're separate. And even lawyers, corporate lawyers who haven't studied arbitration law, they don't necessarily really think the two contracts are separate. It's a principle that arbitrage tribunals first invented to maximize the number of cases that go to arbitration. The two are separate. So if you separate them, that means two different laws govern. And you select the law that would maximize the number of cases that actually go to arbitration. In each one of these cases, you might have noticed, whether it's the courts, whether it's the arbitral tribunals, they actually find a way to save the validity of the arbitration agreement. If you are on the other side, it could really be very annoying. If you are on the side that actually wants to go to arbitration, it's very gratifying. And the one thing that I can tell you about the London courts, I've had the opportunity to supervise cases before different jurisdictions. But the London courts are most reliable in terms of when you go to the High Court, they don't really make nonsensical decisions a lot of times. There might be justices here and there. A lot of times, their decisions are very reasoned, very considered. Even when there is arbitral extravaganza, they try to bring things to order. The problem is litigating before UK courts. It could be lengthy and extremely expensive. But once you have that opportunity to present your case before a learned justice or judge, they usually make decisions according to the facts and the law. You cannot say the same thing about courts in many parts of the world. So a seat in London is not a bad choice, although it has its own complications. At some point, somebody who knows things would actually look at it very closely and with no other intention than just to administer the law. I've had cases that were taken to appealed to the High Court for purposes of lengthening the litigation and increasing cost 4 different times. The same case. It goes and then it comes back. They lose, they appeal, and then they get struck down. Each step of the way I've seen that the last time the court was so annoyed that the decision was one line. The justice, the High Court judge said, the question of law in this case is obvious. Full stop. Case dismissed. He didn't reason after so much hearing. So, not to promote London courts, but the reality is that they actually believe it. But obviously, and under Article 69 of the UK 1996, Section 69, we're here. There is a provision that actually allows the court to review a little bit, review the merits of the case. Not a full-fledged review, but for fundamental areas of law. So arbitration is really tame, it's constrained in London. So people who actually like this unlimited kind of arbitrary discretion, they don't like London. They go to Paris. The French courts are laissez-faire. They even invented what is called a transnational arbitration order. And there's transnational arbitration law. To me, it's interesting that they have people who know that. Okay, 2 more cases. Again, back to the UK court, but this was a very, very old case, 1894. Contract was made where? In England. It was supposed to be performed where? In Scotland. And the application of one Scottish law would have done what to the arbitration agreement? It would have avoided the application of London law or UK law would have upheld, right? That's why the parties were before the UK application. Place of contractors, the next contractors, the place where the contract was made, and the place of performance. So if you apply the law of the place of performance, no arbitration agreement, because What was the reason, the grounds for invalidity?
Arbitrators are not nominated.
Exactly. Remember that case? We talked about that. In the old days, many states, for some reason, had that law that said, unless you name the arbitrators, it's invalid. So Scottish law would have required the arbitration agreement to have nominated the arbitrators. In this case, there was an arbitration agreement, but there was no nomination. Therefore, the application of Scottish law would have basically killed the arbitration agreement. The application of UK law, on the other hand, would have upheld the validity of the arbitration agreement. The contract was made in the United Kingdom, was supposed to have been performed in Scotland. So the court was confronted with the question of which one applies in the absence of a specific selection by the parties. So which did they select? Why? Because the contract was made there, right? Basically, when they made the contract, we cannot imagine, it's the same logic, right? There's no way that we should assume that the parties had made a contract knowing quite well that it would not be enforced. It's irrational, it's unreasonable to assume so. So every time businessmen make a decision, the court thinks that they actually make a rational decision, a rational choice. Is that a fair assumption? Not when it comes to arbitration. You will see if you practice in this area. Business people pay the least amount of attention to a dispute settlement clause because when they get into a business deal, they actually don't think that. It's like marriage. They don't think that it's going to break apart. They always think that it's going to go on forever. And they don't want to anticipate, if something goes bad, we should do this. That is the last thing that they think about when they actually start doing business together. That's why you see all sorts of very unusual contractual insertions in like 2 different dispute settlement provisions in what is supposed to be highly sophisticated contractual instrument. It's not unusual. Second, usually parties use form contract. They vary the fundamental substantive provisions, the price, the quantity, things like that, and leave everything else the same. They just sign it. Something gets messed up somewhere, and then they end up with some kind of what they call pathological arbitration agreement. And then the courts are confronted with the idea of, they must not have intended to enter into an arbitration agreement. If they entered into an arbitration agreement, they obviously wanted it to be valid. We're not going to choose a law that would kill it. Whether it's a fair assumption or not depends on each individual case. You cannot make any kind of generalization about, businessmen always think rationally and they must have anticipated that it is a valid one. So, this whole case is obviously for the purpose of demonstration. And again, they arrive at, this is seat, this is also seat. This one is an interesting case. It's a Third Circuit Court of Appeals case. It is very technical, so it will take us to this chart. First question. You might have noticed, all are Italian parties. All of them. All of them. How did they end up before the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in the United States? The respondent, the claimant, everybody, the insurance company, the owner of the vessel, everybody. These are Italian parties. This is a third-party claim, right? The insurance company paid, right? And then it was proceeding. And the insurance company was proceeding against the ship owner. They said the ship owner was negligent. The ship that they rented was not seaworthy. So they wanted to get reimbursed the amount of money that they paid to the client. How did this thing end up in the United States?
Maybe the enforcement in the United States.
No, that's not right. There's something else. It's not about arbitration at all. It's about court litigation. What happened? What took them there?
So the vessel was burned in the United States.
Huh? Which one? So they went to court where? Huh? Right, but now, this case is not an arbitration case, right? It is a court case. It went before the First Circuit Court of Appeals. To go to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, it must have originated in the district court somewhere in the United States. How did it originate in the district? Yes?
Because they went to the district court of Virgin Islands first.
Why?
I don't know about Virgin Islands.
It says it there. How did they end up in Virgin Islands District Court? Yeah, that's where the burning occurred. It was docked in the Virgin Islands. The accident happened there. See? Because the accident happened within the United States territory, the district court had jurisdiction on cases that actually arose out of that particular transaction. Right? It's like if a plane crashes in your territory, disputes relating to that crash could actually be litigated in that jurisdiction. So who took advantage of this circumstance and went to a U.S. court? Who took advantage? And did it make sense? Who was it that actually wanted to go to court? The insurance company. The insurance company, they actually paid off the liability, but they sued the ship owner because they said it wasn't seaworthy. And you can imagine that the vessel itself, well, that was partially burned, must have been attached. Right? If they had succeeded in the lawsuit, it could be sold to satisfy the judge, the court judge. But obviously, the party that was sued came before the U.S. District Court in the Virgin Islands and said the court lacks jurisdiction because disputes arising out of any relationship, the shipment must be referred to arbitration in Italy. Then it becomes a question of the New York Convention, whether or not the court in Virgin Islands should enforce the arbitration agreement. And of course that also meant whether or not the arbitration agreement was valid, and of course that required the identification of the applicable law to decide that particular question. This case has a little bit of complication, right? What is that? The arbitration?
They refer to arbitration in London.
in London. What law was supposed to apply?
Italian law. But the cause is here the Italian law did not apply because it will lead to the arbitration agreement void.
Yes, that's precisely why the party who wanted to go to court said, if you apply Italian law would have invalidated, right, the arbitration agreement. And the two parties do not agree as to the interaction between Article 2.3 and Article 5.1a. This is an excellent example of how the two could result in different conclusions. Now, take a look at the first paragraph on 299. It says, what really does contend is that under the terms of the convention, the arbitration clause in issue is unenforceable. And this pertains to somewhat ambiguous provision in Article 2.3 of the convention. When the arbitration clause refers to a place of arbitration, here in Naples, Italy, the law of that place is determinated. It then relies on the affidavit of Italian law, which states that the Italian arbitration clause calling for an even number of arbitrators is null and void. See, this is a great example of how the law of the seat or some other law could be broader than the law under this, which is null and void, inoperative, incapable of being performed, which was interpreted as fraud, duress, mistake, waiver. Limited interpretation in many jurisdictions. Now, here what you have is even number of arbitrators would actually kill the arbitration agreement. It is longer. The grounds of invalidity here is longer. So what Rooney's argument is that this and this must be read to be identical. There is no reason to think, according to them, that these two provisions should contain two different substantive rules. It makes no sense. In other words, this should be limited to these things. Why? They say it just makes sense. Why have all this problem of two different outcomes? Why wait until the award is made and say, oh, there is additional ground of invalidity? Isn't that what this calls for? It is possible that an arbitration agreement is found perfectly valid under Article 2.3, but invalid under Article 5.1a because 1a refers to a domestic law that could potentially be broader than 2.3. So the argument here makes perfect sense that how do 100 nations get together and make that kind of absurd rule? So, was the Third Circuit Court of Appeals impressed with that argument? Did they agree? They did not. They did not. Why not? What do they say?
They said the language should be interpreted narrowly, so the even number will not lead to the arbitration agreement invalid, because as shown in Article 2, the void situation is very limited, so we should interpret them limitedly.
So that sort of looks like they're adopting this rather than this, right? Because now we are here, not here. What they're asked to do is bring this here rather than bring this here. So they want to expand the grounds of invalidity under Article 2.3 to include the law of the seat. This is what they've been asked. It's not this. They would have probably upheld this, but they refused to uphold this one. And they never ruled on this, whether the two are equal or identical. They did not say anything about that. But in this particular case, we don't believe that the grounds of invalidity under 5.1a should be imported into 2.3, because 2.3 is very clear and unambiguous. It has three things of invalidity. Interpret those. You cannot bring this even number thing into that, because that obviously is outside of that limited set of grounds. So, all of these apply the law of the seat of the tribunal, except for this one seems to have applied the New York Convention. Rules of validity. Now there's one last point on this issue. One of the questions that Ruling raises here is exactly what we've been talking about. It says, if you approve it here, when we know that in the seat of the arbitration it's invalid because it contains even number of arbitrators, what's the point? If they get an award, they're going to come back to enforce it, right? And they're going to take a second look at it and say, apply their own law. And they say, no, we're not going to enforce it. So what's the point of upholding it now when we know eventually it's going to come back to the same court, and the same court is allowed to apply its own laws to say, no, I'm not going to enforce this. That was the argument they raised, right? It's a strong one. What was the response to that the Third Circuit Court of Appeals gave? Good point, they say, but they had a way out.
Enforcement may be refused, but not necessary.
Exactly. It says enforcement may be refused. It doesn't say shall be refused. Therefore, they may enforce it. But that's not the most interesting argument. Right? They say that it's an important one. But think about it. What is the other reason why this still makes sense? It still makes sense. Why? Under the New York Convention, what can you do? Do you have to necessarily go back to the same court where you know that the law will be validated? If you have an award, what are your options for enforcement? What are your options for enforcement? One. What else? If you go to the place where the arbitral award is met, you could have a problem because they're going to apply this even number rule and say the arbitration agreement was not valid in the first place. And then they refuse. They may refuse.
And go to a state court that the law of that state will not invalidate the agreement.
Yeah, go to a different jurisdiction, right? Go to a completely different jurisdiction where you know that they're not going to invalidate it. But now the problem is that state is actually required to apply the laws of the place where the award is met. That's where the may refuse actually is more interesting, because it's another court that may not refuse. The same court would probably would refuse. If you go to the seat, if you go to Italy in this case, for instance, chances are the Italian courts would actually strike it down. But if you take it to Virgin Islands, where they were actually detaining the partially burnt vessel, they could uphold it because the New York Convention here says may refuse. That means they may not refuse. Even if it's invalid under the law of the seat of the arbitration, a Virgin Island court might give it effect. Make sense? So there are two possibilities. Once you get an award that you know will be challenged because of the invalidity of the arbitration agreement under the law of the place where the award is made, the first choice that you have is to go back to the same court and ask them to enforce. Your chances are low. The second possibility is to take it to another court and ask them to enforce it. They may, because under the New York Convention, they are arguably permitted to enforce an award that could be considered invalid under the laws of the place where the arbitration award is made. That is the point that the Third Circuit Court of Appeals is trying to make. In any case, they did not rule on the question of whether or not Article 2.3 and Article 5.1a contain the same or the identical set of rules. The argument was that it makes perfect sense. There's no reason why you should imagine that two provisions within the same convention would have two different set of rules for the decision of the exact same question. If you think about it, the question is identical, whether or not the arbitration agreement is good. Why do we need two sets of rules for the determination of the same question just because the question is asked at a different time? The only difference is actually when the question is asked. Otherwise, the question remains exactly the same. The question is the same. So why have two sets of rules for the determination of the exact same question isn't it a complete waste of resources, time, and energy? That is really the question. If you were allowed, if you were permitted to amend the New York Convention, would you make that change? Yes? Make it identical? Yes.
If we use the second possibility to choose another court, I think it may be limited, right? Because we cannot choose any places in order to enforce it.
Okay, that's absolutely right. You need to go to a place where there is some assets, right? Otherwise, it makes no sense. In this case, apparently, the vessel, I don't know how long they detained it, was actually in Virgin Islands. They were working on it, and they probably, because it was burnt partially. So the whole reason why they went to a port in Virgin Islands is because the insurance company knew that, oh, there's this thing. If I get an engagement, then I'm going to sell this thing and satisfy the port. So you could probably take it there. Or these companies have assets everywhere, right? You could just follow them, especially insurance companies, shipping companies. They're all over the place. You can even detain the vessels when they're unloading stuff. You can even get lien on some of the things that they carry. There's a lot of creative advocacy that takes place to get to assets, to satisfy assets. Satisfy judgment or reward. Okay? Alright, and here's what I can tell you. The discussion from now on will get a little bit more, a little bit less complicated. Why? Because you now know some of the basic principles: separability, competence, and choice of law. It's a combination of these. So going from this stage to the final stages, it's going to be done. But the same things keep coming back. Once you understood these, I think it's going to be useful. So the classes so far, that's like I front load the complex materials, have been the most complicated ones. So it's going to get easier as we go. All right, so we're meeting again tomorrow at 6 p.m. Unfortunately, not for you, but it's all right. So let's proceed with the reading materials. And as I said, you should find them a little bit easier than the previous subject class.